Have you ever thought about like one that never runs dry? No matter how much you take from it, it's always full.
Kind of like an endless supply.
Yeah, exactly. And it got me thinking, that's kind of a cool way to picture what we're digging into today, on the deep dive.
An endless well of
Yeah.
ideas.
We're going deep into chapter 4 of the BFG Handbook, the Christian edition of the Tao Te Ching.
Okay.
And this chapter is all about, well, they call it the nature of God.
I like that.
Yeah.
Get into the heart of it.
Yeah. And, this chapter, it really tries to present like a new angle on God's love
Okay.
with this whole idea of restoring the truth.
Yeah, and what I think is so fascinating is that it's kind of weaving together these core Christian ideas, right, with the wisdom from the Tao Te Ching,
Right.
which is this ancient text all about living in harmony with, the natural order of the universe.
Yeah. The Tao Te Ching is sort of like, think of it as a collection of these really profound sayings and poems.
Like little nuggets of wisdom.
Exactly. And it's been around for centuries.
Yeah, they're powerful.
So everyone listening, today we're aiming to pull out the most important things this chapter has to say about, the nature of God.
Sounds good.
We're going to be tackling some pretty big concepts, like this idea of God's never-ending nature, his role in creation and in bringing things back together, like reconciliation,
Right.
how he can be unseen but always there.
A paradox.
It is. And also how this chapter talks about the sun.
Okay, yeah.
And, it starts right off the bat with this really striking image, the endless well. It literally says, the way is an endless well, used by everyone, but never filled up. So unfathomable, the infinite source of all creation.
I mean, you can't get more direct than that, right?
No, you can't.
It's a bold way to start, and I think it immediately takes you to this concept of just how inexhaustible God is, right? His wisdom, his grace, all of it, without limit. And the chapter links this straight to the Christian idea of God as the creator, like back in Genesis 2, the creation story. And of course, you can't forget those powerful words of Jesus in John 14.6.
I am the way, the truth, and the life.
Exactly. Really driving home that concept of an eternal source.
Yeah, and it makes you think there's this constant source of everything we need.
Right there.
And the chapter even brings up Philippians 4.19, that promise that God will supply all our needs.
Yeah, a promise of abundance.
Abundance, that's a perfect word. So if we really think about this idea of an endless well, how does that change things for us in our own lives,
Right.
The handbook uses this term, renewal mindset.
Okay.
What do they mean by that?
Well, I think what they're getting at is this shift, a fundamental shift in how we view our resources and how much we depend on God.
Okay.
So instead of constantly feeling like we're lacking something or like things are limited, it's about truly believing that God's provision, what he offers, is truly unlimited.
I see.
And then from there, the renewal aim becomes about actively seeking, drawing from that endless source of wisdom and resources in our day-to-day lives.
So it's not just a belief, but a way of living.
Exactly. It's not passive, it's engaging, going after it.
Okay, so it's about more than just saying, oh yeah, I believe that. It's about actually trying to tap into it.
Yes.
And the renewal practice, how do we actually do that?
Well, the practice really comes down to dependence on God.
Okay.
Cultivating that dependence. And how do we do that?
Hmm.
Through prayer, constantly turning to him, seeking his will, his guidance in everything we do.
This is like recognizing that we can't do it all on our own.
We need that higher power.
Yeah.
And this is where things get really interesting.
All right.
The chapter moves into this respond section where it starts connecting with how other faiths view this idea of a source.
Okay.
It mentions, Brahman in Hinduism, Dharma in Buddhism, Allah in Islam, this concept of a universal eternal source.
That's a pretty broad spectrum.
It is.
What's the point of bringing that in?
Well, I think it's trying to show us that there's this possible, common thread, this universal human experience of recognizing that we all depend on something bigger than us.
Right.
An ultimate source, however you define it.
Even if we call it different names.
Yeah, exactly. And it even mentions Surah Al-Baqarah in the Quran, which describes Allah as, the ever-living, the sustainer of all.
Wow.
Same idea.
So this respond part, it's not about saying all religions are identical, right?
No.
But it's more like saying, hey, this core idea, depending on something greater, that might actually be what brings humanity together.
Absolutely. It suggests that beyond all the different labels and theologies and all that, there's this shared understanding, we need something beyond ourselves.
Something transcendent.
Yeah, beyond just the material world.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really powerful look into what it means to be human, to be spiritual.
Okay, let's move on to the next big idea. This concept of, well, the chapter puts it like this. It softens sharp edges, untangles the knots, harmonizes the light, and unites the dust of the earth.
Wow, that's poetic.
Isn't it?
Mm.
What do you make of that?
Well, the chapter connects those images, softening edges, untangling knots, to the work of the Holy Spirit.
Okay.
Bringing reconciliation, peace, unity, like those sharp edges. Maybe that represents conflict, division, harshness.
Right.
And the knots could be like broken relationships, issues that just haven't been resolved.
Makes sense.
And harmonizing light, uniting dust. That really points to bringing order and wholeness to a world that feels, often really broken.
Fragmented.
Yes.
And the chapter doesn't just leave these ideas hanging, it links them to specific parts of the Bible.
Right.
Like Ephesians 2, verses 14 through 16, where it talks about breaking down those walls of hostility and bringing reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
And Ephesians 4.3132, that's all about kindness and forgiveness. And of course, there's Matthew 5.9, that super well-known one.
Blessed are the peacemakers.
Exactly. So when we talk about the renewal mindset here, it's about how we handle disagreements, how we deal with conflict, right?
Absolutely. It's encouraging us to deliberately choose this mindset of reconciliation, wanting to understand instead of pushing people away or hanging on to bitterness.
Mm-hmm.
The renewal aim then becomes actively trying to embody that peace, that harmony.
Yeah, putting it into practice.
In how we act, how we treat others, how we navigate life.
And what about the renewal practice? How do we put this into action?
This is where it gets challenging, right? It's about deliberately choosing gentleness in what we say and what we do.
Okay.
Looking for peaceful resolutions, extending forgiveness instead of, holding grudges. It's a constant effort, but it's about being that force for calm and healing in our lives.
And again, in this response section, we see connections to other religious traditions.
Yeah.
Like ahimsa in Hinduism, which is all about nonviolence and compassion. Karuna in Buddhism, this deep empathy, trying to relieve suffering. And the focus on forgiveness in Islam, it even references Surah Ashura. It seems like this idea of peace and compassion, it's universal, isn't it?
It really does feel that way, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What strikes me is that across the board, peace, both within ourselves and with others, and compassion are seen as essential to grow spiritually, no matter what your specific beliefs are. It's like this basic human desire for harmony.
Okay, let's move on to the next idea. And this one's a big one. God being invisible, but always there. The chapter just states it simply, invisible yet always present. And it's a really powerful thought. It can be comforting, but also like, whoa, that's hard to wrap your head around.
It is, isn't it? You're trying to imagine something you can't see.
Exactly.
But this is at the heart of the Christian idea of God's omnipresence.
He's everywhere.
All the time,
Yeah.
even though we can't, physically see him. And the chapter connects us to several places in the Bible, like Colossians 1:15-20, that describes Jesus as, the image of the invisible God.
Yeah.
And John 14:20, where Jesus talks about being in the Father and the Father being in us.
Right, right.
And Psalm 139, that's a beautiful one. It describes God being everywhere you could possibly imagine. Mm. And John 14:16-17 speaks of the Holy Spirit as our constant advocate.
Always there for us. So the renewal mindset here is about consciously making ourselves aware of this presence, even though we can't see it.
Absolutely. It's about cultivating this deep inner knowing.
The trust.
Yes, a trust that he's with you no matter what, no matter your circumstances, how you feel. And then the renewal aim becomes about actually living in that awareness.
Letting it guide you.
Letting it influence your thoughts, your decisions, everything you do.
Wow.
And of course, there's the renewal practice.
Yeah.
How do we become more tuned in to something we can't see or hear?
Yeah, how do we do that?
It's about practicing mindfulness of God's presence in, just ordinary moments.
The everyday stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe it's stopping for a quick prayer, thinking about a verse from the Bible, or just acknowledging that he's there in the middle of everything you're doing.
Okay.
It's about developing the sensitivity to the divine.
That's a good way to put it.
It's all around you.
Yeah. And the response section, it connects to some really interesting parallels in other faiths.
Oh, yeah, I love this part.
Like the idea of Atman in Hinduism, that spark of the divine in everyone.
Right.
The concept of interconnectedness in Buddhism, where everything's linked. Mm-hmm. And in Islam, how Allah is unseen but all-knowing, referencing Surah al-Mulk. It seems like a lot of different religions have wrestled with this idea, you know?
It does, doesn't it? This idea of a divine reality that we can't directly see.
That's beyond our senses.
Beyond our senses, exactly. It hints at a deeper level of connection, a deeper reality than we often acknowledge.
Okay, let's get to the last part of that quote. You may ask whose child it is. I say, he is the son of the living God before existence. This really dives into the Christian understanding of Jesus, doesn't it?
It does. And it speaks to the eternal nature of the Son, the idea that he existed even before the universe was created.
Before anything.
Before anything. And the chapter ties this to Matthew 16:16-17, where Peter declares Jesus as the Christ, the Son of the living God.
Right.
And John 1:1-3, where Jesus is described as the Word, through whom everything was made. And also Colossians 1:16, which emphasizes that all of creation happened through him.
So the renewal mindset in light of this is approaching God with, humility and awe.
Absolutely. Recognizing how vast and eternal he is.
And the renewal aim, I guess, is to try to live our lives aligned with Christ's eternal purpose.
Yeah, understanding that our lives have meaning within that bigger picture.
And the renewal practice, how do we actually live that out?
Well, the chapter points to practicing humility and servant leadership, like Jesus.
Following his example.
Yeah, it refers to Philippians 2:5-8, that powerful passage about Christ's humility, and Matthew 20:28, where Jesus says he came not to be served, but to serve.
To give himself for others.
Exactly. It's about us embodying that same spirit.
And the respond section, even here, connects to similar ideas in other religions.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Like the avatars in Hinduism, for example, Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, who is said to have existed eternally, bodhisattvas in Buddhism who choose to help others even though they could achieve their own enlightenment.
Right.
And in Islam, the concept of Allah's will and knowledge being eternal, it's incredible how many different ways people have tried to express this idea of something beyond time, something divine.
It is. And even though the specifics are different, the core concept is similar. This idea of divinity, of figures chosen by God, existing beyond our limited human understanding of time.
It's like a universal intuition about the divine.
Yes, something beyond the physical world, beyond what we can see and touch.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Chapter 4 of the BFG Handbook, we've really gone through some of the core ideas about God's nature.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about.
It is. We talked about how he's inexhaustible, limitless, his role in bringing reconciliation, unity, his constant unseen presence, and the eternal significance of the Son.
And I think grasping these ideas, really getting them, can give you a whole new way to look at your own life, the things you go through, and even just the world around you. It's grounding, comforting, and it can guide us.
Absolutely. So think about this, everyone. That image of the endless well, what's one area in your life, maybe one problem, one knot you've been struggling with, that you could approach with a new sense of trust, knowing that God's resources are endless. Or how about this? How does the idea of God being present, even though you can't see him, how does that change your perspective on the everyday things you experience? We really want you to keep thinking about these things and maybe even explore some of those connections we talked about between different faiths. Thanks for joining us.